Welcome to the Ash Cloud. I'm Ash Sweeting. Today we are joined by David Tuck, Head of Mission Australia for the International Committee of the Red Cross. David has spent the last 20 years working as a legal advisor at the International Red Cross. During this time, he has witnessed the impacts of conflict on the civilian populations in Africa, the Middle East and Asia, including how the combination of conflict, climate change and food insecurity have a multiplying effect that further weakens the resilience of affected societies.
I think what we would find is that we could overlay a map of those countries or areas that are most affected by conflict, that are most affected by food insecurity, and that at the same time are least able to prevent the effects of climate change and adapt to those same effects. So I think we would see a very, very strong correlation or connection for many countries between all three of those elements. You can see in the Notre Dame Gain Adaptation Index that of the 25 or so countries that are least able to adapt to the implications of the consequences of climate change, about 60 or so % of those countries are currently affected by conflict.
Global food insecurity is increasing.
The 2023 Global Report on Food Crises indicated that some 250 million people globally were food insecure and required urgent food assistance.
War is also increasing.
There are currently 100 armed conflicts globally, with some 60 states and 100 or more non-state armed groups. And that number too, the number of armed conflicts globally, has been on the increase.
The effects are cumulative.
The challenge when we bring these factors together, food insecurity, climate change and conflict, is that they all have this sort of cumulative effect, which is working to really reduce or weaken the resilience of people who are subject to these circumstances. So they have a sort of a multiplying effect or consequences on people who are subject to the worst of conflict, climate change and food insecurity, jeopardizing their capacity ultimately to survive.
Women-headed households are frequently worst affected.
As an organisation, I think we'd be quite keen to point out, of course, that food insecurity in armed conflict doesn't necessarily affect everyone in the same way. And there are various ways, I think, to dissect this part of the conversation. But in many places in which we work, we find in particular that women-headed households are particularly subject to the risks associated with a lack of food of adequate nutritional value. And in places like Syria over the years, we've actually really made sure that our humanitarian interventions reach precisely that cohort of households.
The breakdown of governance and rule of law provides further challenges to addressing the impacts of climate change.
One of the challenges that's been identified in relation to these contexts that are most hard pressed to adapt to the consequences of climate change is that, broadly speaking, there seems to be a lack of access for many of those countries to the climate mitigation and adaptation funding that is otherwise available in the current and global environment.
The war in Ukraine has global food security implications.
And we know that the most recent case in point is, of course, the export of goods, grain particularly, from the Black Sea ports as a result or a consequence of the conflict Ukraine and Russia. And that's been a massive problem with massive global implications.
Conflict-affected people move.
Half the population of Syria left Syria. I mean, it was at a particularly acute scale, and it really did draw a huge amount of attention. I mean, clearly, Ash, displacement as a result of conflict is commonplace in many areas. I mean, there are migration routes through parts of Africa where people are also leaving conflict. We know from Somalia that there are many people currently in Kenya. We've known historically, of course, out of Afghanistan, many people in places like Pakistan. So there is almost inevitably population movement as a result of conflict.
Dave, thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, g'day Ash. Thanks so much for having me on behalf of the International Committee of the Red Cross.
Hunger and food security are frequently associated with armed conflict, and in most cases, it's the civilian populations who are the most severely affected both by the conflict and by the subsequent hunger and food insecurity. Are there any experiences during the years you've worked with the International Committee of the Red Cross that you can share with us about what life is like for civilians living under those circumstances?
Yeah, thanks, Ash. I mean, this question or topic of the intersection really of conflict and food security or food insecurity, as the case may be, is of utmost importance to us as a humanitarian organisation, an area of, I think, serious concern in many of the places in which we work. And you'll very much be aware that the 2023 global report on food crises indicated that some 250 million people globally were food insecure and required urgent food assistance. What was particularly alarming, I think, about that number is that in the 7-year history of the report, it was to date the highest number of people who are globally food insecure. And at exactly the same time, and here the data I lean on is of our organisation, the International Committee of the Red Cross, we would point to the fact that there are currently 100 armed conflicts globally, with some 60 states and 100 or more non-state armed groups. And that number too, the number of armed conflicts globally, has been on the increase, and certainly in the last two decades. The implications for people, coming to your question, I mean, evidently are extremely serious. I think at the most severe, it's cause or risk of severe illness and death, which are of most concern to an organisation like ours. It's not infrequent that we hear stories of people eating twice a day only, sometimes once a day, in certain circumstances having to forego meals for the entire day, given the circumstances in which they find themselves. Interestingly enough, for me, I think the stories at the intersection of conflict and food security that had the most profound impact were those related to the circumstances in the Middle East around about 2015, 16, and 17, where siege of urban areas in particular was very commonly practiced. And many of us, I think, can recall the examples of Aleppo, Eastern Ghouta, Madaya, Fua, Kefraya, and other urban centers in Syria at that time, from which the stories of people being exposed to severe food insecurity were dramatic and harrowing. The stories very much of the sort of hollow faces of children who were searching in the remnants of their urban environment for grass or herbs to eat by the side of the road, such as was the situation at the time. People in absolute dire need of medical attention, precisely for the fact that they've not been able to consume anything of sufficient nutritional value, but were unable even to access medical services. Such was the complete separation of their environment from the rest of the world. And I think many of those stories have really stuck with me for many years ever since. One of the main concerns I think that we have around the exposure to food insecurity in situations of conflict is precisely how people will have to take fairly extreme measures or adapt very harmful coping strategies to be able to put enough food on the table and to be able to survive. And so people will cut back on a range of essential services, everything from and including education, which will be foregone in favor of simply surviving day in, day out. And we know in a place like Syria that there's been a whole generation of young people who really missed out on educational opportunities. In South Sudan, we have stories of people being forced by severe food insecurity to harvest early, so to harvest their crops before those crops are ready to be harvested, and that's a sort of dramatic step that they have to take to survive. And of course, that has then flow-on long-term implications in terms of their capacity to survive and overall crop production in the context in which they live. As an organisation, I think we'd be quite keen to point out, of course, that food insecurity in armed conflict doesn't necessarily affect everyone in the same way. And there are various ways, I think, to dissect this part of the conversation. But in many places in which we work, we find in particular that women-headed households are particularly subject to the risks associated with a lack of food of adequate nutritional value. And in places like Syria over the years, we've actually really made sure that our humanitarian interventions reach precisely that cohort of households who are subject to these extremes. We know that people who are displaced are particularly at risk of the implications of food insecurity, not least of all people who've used to taking their food from the land or the crops on the land on which they live and sustaining themselves. They find themselves in displacement where they have much less access to food. And another category, for want of a better way to describe it, of persons about whom we're particularly concerned are people deprived of their liberty or detainees. We are mandated, particularly in times of armed conflict, to work for the benefit and to ensure humane treatment and conditions for people deprived of their liberty. And certainly there are a category of people who are extremely vulnerable and very much subject to the whims, of course, of the detaining authority. They're totally dependent on what the detaining authority will authorize to enter detention facilities. So it's been a long-term concern of ours that when the broader environment in which detainees find themselves is facing challenges related to, for example, food insecurity, that often detainees will be the last people considered in terms of their immediate needs, and as such, they're particularly vulnerable.
In terms of in these situations, how do you go about providing humanitarian and food assistance to people in these situations, given that it's the middle of a war zone?
Yeah, look, it's a very good question, and there's a lot of different components to the answer. I mean, one of the things that we do fundamentally as an organization to secure access, which is key, access both to places but also very much to people, is we speak with all sides and all parties involved. I mean, that's very core and central to the modus operandi of an organization like the ICRC. We're neutral, independent, and impartial, which is a sort of enabler or facilitator for access to people in need. Key also in this discussion is proximity. And proximity precisely to the people for whom we work, which means that we would hopefully be consistently in a position where we're able to assess ourselves the needs that individuals have, but not only that, also very much to follow up. And that's part of the due diligence, I think, of distributing or providing humanitarian aid in a modern and professional manner, consistent with the expectations of contemporary humanitarian action, that we can then return to people to whom we have distributed humanitarian assistance and ensure that it reached the intended destination. On food insecurity more broadly, though, I think it's probably key to sort of step back for a moment and point out that sometimes the humanitarian solution or response is not necessarily or not exclusively the provision of material goods, commodities, food itself. Very often in some of these cases, at least, there are considerations related to protection work, access, and sometimes just humanitarian diplomacy to unblock some of the challenges to access to food, rather than substitute for the authorities by providing goods to people who are desperately in need. So there's a range or a sort of palette of activities that ought to be undertaken at the sort of preventive end, and also very much in that really concrete humanitarian response.
You mentioned earlier that both the number of people facing severe hunger and food insecurity, as well as the number of armed conflicts going on currently in the world, is the highest in recent decades. How do you think climate change is affecting this both the food insecurity and the hunger, as well as the conflicts in the world?
Yeah, Ash, good question. I mean, not least of all, just as it's currently the last day of COP 28, I think what we would find is that we could overlay a map of those countries or areas that are most affected by conflict, that are most affected by food insecurity, and that at the same time are least able to prevent the effects of climate change and adapt to those same effects. So I think we would see a very, very strong correlation or connection for many countries between all three of those elements. I mean, you can see in the Notre Dame Gain Adaptation Index that of the 25 or so countries that are least able to adapt to the implications or the consequences of climate change, about 60 or so % of those countries are currently affected by conflict. So there's clearly this strong connection between those elements. That's evident. Climate change and the climate shocks and weather patterns that come with it, I think are likely to have a range of dramatic implications for situations of conflict. I mean, first, of course, is in terms of the implications for production. Certain climates will have more trouble producing the goods or the produce and the food required for survival. Weather shocks can also have more narrow implications, meaning to say even consequences that one might reasonably otherwise or normally otherwise find in conflict, like displacement. And people displaced by a weather event are going to be in similar circumstances to those displaced by conflict in terms of access to food and food insecurity as a general rule. I also think that overall, from a sort of broad humanitarian perspective, the challenge when we bring these factors together, food insecurity, climate change, and conflict, is that they all have this sort of cumulative effect, which is working to really reduce or weaken the resilience of people who are subject to these circumstances. So they have a sort of a multiplying effect or consequences on people who are subject to the worst of conflict, climate change, and food insecurity, jeopardizing their capacity ultimately to survive. In certain countries in which we work, I think we can already see the implications of climate and climate shocks for people in these circumstances. So just to give you one example, in Somalia, some of our rain-fed harvest agricultural projects we've actually put on hold or suspended because we have so much trouble anticipating that there will be sufficient rain for any meaningful harvest in the foreseeable future. And we now revert to providing simply cash assistance to the same people who might be in need. And of course, cash assistance is a direct humanitarian response. It has lots of advantages, but it's not likely to be putting the people in need in a position where they will be able to sustain themselves in the future. So it's a huge worry that we've had to turn to this sort of response, just given the climatic situation that we're witnessing in a place like Somalia currently. I think we'd also add that one of the challenges that's been identified in relation to these contexts that are most hard pressed to adapt to the consequences of climate change is that, broadly speaking, there seems to be a lack of access for many of those countries to the climate mitigation and adaptation funding that is otherwise available in the current and global environment. And that's because many of these countries affected by conflict, they're less stable, have less strong governance structures, are possibly less able to demonstrate that they're able to kind of meaningfully implement climate risk mitigation and adaptation projects. And as such, they're often less eligible for the funding or the money that is otherwise available to adapt. So what we see is this sort of cyclical problem where they are most at risk and most exposed, but they are getting the least support in terms of being able to improve their own circumstances and situation.
I imagine there's a concern that, given those relationships between climate change, food insecurity, conflict, and just the vulnerability of the populations, that these situations, or there's likely, it would be much harder to establish good governance and peaceful societies in these places once conflict has started. Is that something that is aligned with your experience?
Yeah, I mean, looking at this relationship between food scarcity and conflict that sort of operate possibly in a sort of causal loop. I mean, they run round in circles. One can cause the other. Of course, pointing to food insecurity as a cause of conflict is in certain circumstances complicated. It's complicated precisely because the nature of conflict is that there are inevitably a wide variety of drivers in any particular case, from politics to personalities. And in this constellation, there's no doubt, though, that resource scarcity might, in certain circumstances, some more than others, be a driver towards insecurity and conflict. If you turn that paradigm around the other way, upside down a little bit, and wonder about the implications of conflict on food insecurity. I think in that space, it's relatively clear the lines of causation, and certainly there are some measures that would suggest that in 2022, on the basis of available information in 2023, that about 120 million people have been pushed into food insecurity precisely by conflict and insecurity. On that, I think it's important only to pause for a moment and just recognize that for food insecurity too, I mean, conflict is not likely to be the only or the sole driver. I mean, there are a range of other factors that play into the current global situation in terms of access to food, not least of all economic environment. We're still suffering in many places from the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of inflation or economic or financial currency depreciation, and that's having an impact on people's capacity to purchase, to buy in context, the cost of goods, which obviously directly affects food availability or food insecurity issues. And there are a range of other factors, of course, leading to food insecurity. We touched on climate change there. Weather events, natural disasters are evidently having a massive impact on people's access to food. So there's a range of different factors, I think, that are driving towards a current global circumstances of access or lack of access to food, and they all sort of interplay one to another. They're all connected, I think, many of those factors. But for conflict specifically, I mean, it's quite clear that conflict can have implications through the whole of the food system, from the very front end, which I suppose is sort of production of food. And it's been a concern, I think, of many people, the ICRC included, that the conflict, just simply the violence and hostilities in Ukraine, will affect or has been affecting the planting season and the capacity to produce, and that will continue to be the case. There are other factors, I think, related to crop and food production connected to conflict, including, for example, the implications, which may potentially be quite long running, of unexploded ordnance or explosive remnants of war. We know from our own experience that, you know, a farmer's field littered with unexploded ordnance will be hard to access potentially for a very, very long time, with great risk to the individuals concerned. That's at the food production end, and then the same challenges, I think, can apply throughout the cycle. I mean, processing of food will be dependent on infrastructure. Is the infrastructure still standing? Do you still have the people, the human capital, the resources, the expertise to process and prepare food between the farm and the consumer? And in many cases, I think in conflict, the answer is probably no. All the way then through to transportation and distribution. And we know that the most recent case in point is, of course, the export of goods, grain particularly, from the Black Sea ports as a result or a consequence of the conflict, Ukraine and Russia. And that's been a massive problem with massive global implications. So there's a range of different areas, I think, in which conflict evidently has a massive impact on capacity to produce and therefore access very much to food.
Have you seen much evidence in this regard with the malicious weaponization of food or pre-food inputs, things like fertilizer or fuel or things that farmers need so they can produce the food for various actors' own political ends?
Yeah, the politicization of food, the politicization sometimes in certain cases of humanitarian action as well, are obviously of immense concern. There's probably a number of different ways to sort of look at that discussion. I mean, evidently at the top level, there are questions related to the way that sanctions do or don't work. I mean, sanctions evidently are intended to have political effect, but they can have consequences that flow onto civilian populations and in certain circumstances, fairly severe humanitarian consequences. That's a complex or delicate balancing act, I imagine, of political and policy decision makers at the top level. Where it comes home very much for an organization or a humanitarian organization like us at the ICRC is really the interplay between the way those sanctions and certain other laws, particularly around counterterrorism, but the way those sanctions interplay or can potentially have consequences for principled humanitarian action, meaning to say that there is a risk sometimes that sanctions, depending on how they're done, can directly impede the capacity of humanitarian actors to deliver on their humanitarian mandates and actually to help people in need. And this has been an area of concern, I think, for the ICRC and others for quite a long time. The good news, at least in our view, is that the two are reconcilable. I mean, you can reconcile the state's interest in having sanctions in certain circumstances and humanitarian action by having ultimately what we would call, a humanitarian exemption. So within a sanctions framework or other relevant legal frameworks, you can have an exemption that allows for impartial humanitarian activities. And it's been a big effort, I think, of the humanitarian community to push for that and to keep that on the global and sometimes domestic agendas in recent years, and particularly, I think, following on from the events of 2001 and the sort of epoch of counterterrorism. So that's at the top level, the relationship, I think, between humanitarian action and sanctions. At the more granular level, meaning to say in armed conflict as such, yes, Ash, I mean, I think, and it's a massive concern, that food is weaponized. It really is a massive concern. The examples I cited earlier of siege in the Middle East, particularly in those years around about 2016, is a case in point. And siege as a method of warfare has been with us, with humanity, probably for as long as warfare has been with us. What's changed possibly over time is that it's now increasingly difficult to siege only the enemy's armed forces. When one sieges the enemy, one tends to capture in that a large part of the civilian population with disastrous consequences. So the sort of dynamics of it in de facto or real terms has changed. And another thing that I think has changed in intervening years is that the legal framework, the international legal framework around the rules that related to the conduct of siege and operations now actually makes it very difficult, I think, to siege, particularly as it affects the civilian population, in a way that would be lawful and consistent with modern law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law. Amongst many, many other relevant rules, there is a prohibition, frankly, of the starvation of the civilian population, and that alone, I think, would jeopardize the sort of legality of a lot of what we see in terms of siege in the modern day. So access to food in that sense, I think has certainly been and continues to be weaponized to great humanitarian concern.
On the topic of the Geneva Conventions, the laws that govern armed conflict, are there any figures you have on the frequency they are being grossly violated or violated, and if that's changing over recent years, as is the number of conflicts going on?
Yeah, that's a really good question and very difficult. One of the challenges, I think, with a body of law like international humanitarian law is that it's very difficult sometimes to demonstrate a sort of causation, meaning to say to demonstrate how and where that body of law works, and also conversely to demonstrate in sort of numerical terms how and where it doesn't work. I mean, obviously, we're deeply concerned about unfolding events, including unfolding events in these very days, in terms of compliance with international humanitarian law. We've rather, in recent years, sought to argue that although it's difficult to prove, international humanitarian law continues to work, and we've done a range of different activities to show instances or circumstances or practical examples of precisely where that body of law has been used to good, positive humanitarian effect, and where there's been compliant or lawful behaviour. We have a website called IHL in Action, which demonstrates precisely that point. The challenge, I think, associated with it is to say, when IHL violations do not take place, what can we attribute that to? Is it attributable directly to the law? And are we even able to measure it, meaning to say it's very difficult to demonstrate how many, if I can put it in stark terms, how many murders did not take place, if you want to think about it through those terms. So demonstrating the sort of effectiveness of IHL in positive terms is quite difficult, but we all know from contemporary media reporting that there are concerns about the extent to which there is in fact compliance with that body of law. If we turn, I think, particularly to the question of IHL and food insecurity, I mean, evidently for an organisation like ours, a key point to pass would be that greater compliance with that body of law would have an impact, a positive impact on the greater challenge of food insecurity in situations of armed conflict. There's a prohibition of starvation that I mentioned, but there's a range of other relevant rules, including rules related to protection of objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, which also include agricultural products, foodstuffs, and the like. So if these rules were steadfastly assured, then the challenge of food insecurity in some complex circumstances would be less severe. There are similarly the rules around humanitarian action and providing for the needs of civilians under one's control, which would also have a significant impact on this problem set in many conflicts. So that area and reinforcing the law, I think, is a key component of how we would work to address this broader problem set that we're discussing.
Back to Syria and what happened there in the height of that conflict, which was the huge migration crisis that then moved on and affected Europe, and hence it made all the newspapers and the headlines because it affected Europe. How common is the migration that is the result of a war like the war in Syria? Are there similar things going on elsewhere in the world at the moment that are not getting the same amount of attention as the European migration crisis about 10 years or so got?
Yeah, no, look, it certainly did get a lot of attention. I mean, it was of a scale, half the population of Syria left Syria. I mean, it was at a particularly acute scale, and it really did draw a huge amount of attention. I mean, clearly, Ash, displacement as a result of conflict is commonplace in many areas. I mean, there are migration routes through parts of Africa where people are also leaving conflict. We know from Somalia that there are many people currently in Kenya. We've known historically, of course, out of Afghanistan, many people in places like Pakistan. So there is almost inevitably population movement as a result of conflict in many places. Now, whether it's happened in recent years to the scale of that which happened over a relatively short period of time in and around Syria, possibly not. But we could look, for example, at the early days of the recent escalation of the conflict in Ukraine to point to another example of a large movement of populations, both internally, domestically, but also across international borders. So I think that will always and continue to be one of the humanitarian consequences of conflict, yes.
I know it's not directly the mandate of the international community, the Red Cross, but from your opinion, is there anything you can share on what more could be done to prevent, given the correlation between climate change and the geopolitical stability, be that because of weather events or disasters or because of the development of armed conflict? Is there anything that you would advocate for the international community to be doing to try and prevent these disasters and conflicts?
Yeah, look, I think there's probably a lot that we could all be doing across a range of different issues on the food insecurity issue specifically. I mean, in addition to sort of reaffirming the law and recalling that if steadfastly assured, that would have positive implications. I think other areas in which we're invested and thinking about are the kind of need for the international community to sort of make a concerted effort to identify and address potential points of disruption to food availability at the global, regional, and also at the domestic or local levels, trying to identify those points, understanding where the weakness in food systems sit, and to develop plans or ideas or strategies to be able to cope with those or address or resolve those weaknesses in in global food availability. And we all know that the international food systems are naturally particularly vulnerable. We only have to look at the case of the Ever Given, the ship that belonged to the Evergreen Group that got stuck in Suez Canal, to recall that there are a number of very tight global choke points on global food supply. And of course, the one in conflict that we've discussed is particularly these days the Black Sea ports and the availability of grain out of that area. So we know that there's particular vulnerabilities in terms of global, regional, and local food systems. One of the solutions, at least in part, viewed very much through a humanitarian lens, is what's called anticipatory humanitarian action, as some people would call it. And that is really trying to gather, to the best of our ability, all of the relevant data points, be they data points on rainfall or on other weather patterns, to try to sort of forecast to the greatest extent possible the potential impact on, amongst many other things, food insecurity. And what you can do, if you can use the data that's available, collate that data as appropriate to build the best possible picture, is you can actually put in place mechanisms to be able to sound the alarm, sort of early warning systems, for want of a better way to describe it. And you're also able, in the same vein, to be able to put into place mechanisms, including funding mechanisms, to be able to address or respond to that particular outcome if you can anticipate it coming on the horizon. And this anticipatory action, I think, is particularly important as relates to food insecurity, because the data points around that might make, in some circumstances, it reasonably easy to predict. Predicting other elements of the sort of cumulative crisis that we're discussing today, Ash, are much more difficult. I mean, predicting conflict is naturally more difficult, although one can make efforts in that domain as well. So anticipatory action, identifying and addressing the areas of potential concern are key. For us, much more narrowly as a humanitarian organization too, I think what we're really interested in doing is making sure that for food insecurity particularly, we have very targeted responses. When I say targeted responses, I mean some of those groups of people who are particularly exposed. We mentioned, amongst others, those who've been displaced, detainees, and others, making sure that as a humanitarian responder, we're able to engage with them and address their needs specifically in the context in which we find them is going to be vitally important. I mean, of course, all of this and the global challenge that we confront in this constellation of crises are obviously, I mean, above and beyond what humanitarian actors alone are able to achieve, and there needs to be a sort of global and concerted effort with the right financing and financial support to address many of these challenges. But for our piece of the puzzle, that's where we're particularly concentrated or focused.
David, thank you so very much for sharing everything with us. Before we go, is there anything else that we haven't discussed that you think is worthwhile adding?
No, look, I mean, I think the topic you're looking at is very important, and I think it's going to continue to be, for all the wrong reasons, of course, of utmost importance to many humanitarian actors. I think one thing that we can draw out of parts of this discussion, but also the issue more generally, is just how inevitably global this problem set is and is going to become. I mean, in the kind of interconnected nature of global markets, it's increasingly difficult to say, oh, it's another problem of another part of the world. I think we're all a little bit in this together. I mean, not least of all, of course, in the question of climate change and its implications, which we're going to have to address as a global issue. Be that as it may, it's evident that there are places right now where there are greater implications of things like food insecurity. The African continent, for example, is particularly affected, with something like 150 million people currently food insecure. And within the African continent, this discussion's really, I think, resurfaced in recent years, as you know, for reasons related to the Eastern Horn region, which has been particularly heavily impacted. In all of this, actually, if we zoom outside of the African continent, we can also put the cursor on places like Afghanistan, places like Yemen as well, all conflict affected and all suffering from really severe examples of food insecurity. And in all of this constellation, I think for an organization like ours, an area of concern is the inability or the difficulty of keeping people's and global attention on some of these crises, which are decades protracted and which continue even to this day, where there are very serious humanitarian implications, but maintaining global attention and global response is often, I think, particularly difficult. So something of which we're very cognizant that there are many parts of the world that are very heavily affected and that don't receive the attention that they would deserve from a humanitarian perspective.
David, thank you very, very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Ash.
You've been listening to The Ash Cloud with me, Ash Sweeting, in conversation with David Tuck, recorded in California in December 2023.